Hi, this is State Delegate Mark Corman, and from Wisconsin Avenue in District 16 to Pratt Street in Baltimore to the Boardwalk on the Eastern Shore and everywhere in between, Conduit Street Podcast is the go-to source for news about Maryland politics and policy.
Hello and welcome to the Conduit Street Podcast. Kevin Kinnally here with Michael Sanderson. Michael, session has wrapped up. It is post-sine die here on Wednesday, April 20th. Annapolis is slowing down, although they are going to rip down the parking garage that we all love and use. So that's going to be the next hot topic in Annapolis. But what are your thoughts, just quickly reflecting on this session? It was a weird one where we started off with a lot more protocols than we finished with, but a lot different than the last few years, I'd say.
Yeah, I'm feeling pretty good, Kevin. I'm glad to be plugged back in post-session. And I mean, I think we want to take a little time, not just a one shot, but over the next few weeks, we want to tie up some loose ends on issues that faced Maryland and issues that faced counties in this last legislative session. But things were inching in the direction of normal. And toward the end of the legislative session, it started to feel more in person and more, I don't know, I use that word hand-to-hand combat, but sort of more face-to-face interactions and negotiations and so forth. It was starting to feel a little more like our old selves. So glad to be back into the flow and glad to be back online recording.
And we will, over the next few weeks, include the policy team from MACo on episodes of the podcast to tie up those loose ends that you talked about. And to start today, we have with us Dominic Butchko, MACo policy team. Dom covers environment, planning and zoning, IT, among many different issues. And we have Dom here today to go through a number of high-profile issues from this past session, including MACo's EMS initiative, which we'll get into. We'll talk about the big climate bill, sweeping legislation that got a lot of attention, and then some other odds and ends. Dominic, thanks so much for joining us today. How are you?
I am happy session is over. How are you, Kevin?
I'm hanging in there. So Dom, let's jump right into it. And thank you for being with us. Let's first talk about Climate Solutions Now Act of 2022. We have seen ginormous climate bills over the past few years. This one passed. It was heavily amended, but this is sweeping climate legislation, right, Dom? And the governor let this bill become law without his signature.
Yeah, so this bill was pretty big, and as Michael said before, hand-to-hand combat, and MACo really had this with this bill. It expedites the statewide goal to achieve carbon neutral emissions by 2042, 2045. It requires large buildings to reduce their carbon footprint over the next decade and expands the state's fleet of zero-emission vehicles. Most of this bill wasn't really about counties. There were a few components that specifically did deal with counties, though, landfills and schools. So landfills, there was a provision in there to really try to reduce methane emissions. And one of our greatest fears was we have a lot of jurisdictions have solar installations on old landfills. And so these new regulations would basically require counties to go in, who are already doing the right thing, but to go in and disassemble some of those solar installations and put methane mitigation equipment on there. And there was just a ton of questions about the benefits of solar versus the cost of mitigation. Luckily, we were able to get those provisions taken out of this bill, but that is going to be a big issue for the 2023 session.
Yeah, I think you're right about that, Don. This issue of a landfill, a place where we've been taking, I guess the term of art is municipal solid waste. We're taking trash and so forth and burying it in landfills. And that generates a spot that emits a good deal of methane. Methane is a contributor to the carbon pollution that we're worried about as a cause and source of concern for climate change. And I guess what has happened in the relatively recent, last year or two is, I think the science on the amount of methane that comes from a landfill has been reevaluated. And I'm not super deep in these details, but as I understand it, we've for years have been measuring methane emissions by sort of walking the surface and measuring from the ground level, but measuring from overhead gives you a different set of numbers. And I think scientists are inclined to think that that's the more accurate measurement. I'm not sure this has been perfected, but that's part of what advanced this issue to be present in the bill as introduced, and I think is still going to be present in Maryland's policy debate going forward. This bill doesn't resolve that issue, but Maryland's going to tackle it sooner or later. What do we do about methane coming from our landfills, right?
And Michael, just to expand on that too, a big issue that we saw specifically in Prince George's County, you have a landfill right next to an old gypsum facility that they now store waste gypsum. So when you're doing these air readings, a lot of that methane isn't actually coming from the landfill. It could be coming from another source, but then that landfill is going to get hit with the penalties for methane when it's not their fault.
I mean, that's one of those things where this is part of the reason why these elements of this big bill came out in this year's bill, but are going to remain alive in the Maryland policy debates going forward. So there will be stakeholders who want to make sure Maryland is doing right on methane emissions, particularly coming from landfills. And as owners and operators of a number of those facilities, we in local government will be at the table saying, okay, let's do this in a reasonable way. Let's agree on the best way to measure, and who bears the cost of whether it's flying an airplane or whatever. I mean, how do you do the measurements? What are the goals that you aspire to? And like you said, there probably needs to be some sort of reasonableness test in, like, let's not be blind and say everybody has to reduce by X% period, because then, like, if you tear down a solar array to reduce some methane from a facility that's been closed for 15 years, you probably have cut off your nose to spite your face. That's not a sensible outcome. So I think we got to come up with a balance on how to do this in a reasonable way that doesn't ignore some of the realities on the ground, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think this is going to be, like you both have said, an ongoing conversation. Methane is a big deal, and this bill, let's be clear, this bill is a massive piece of legislation. It's going to do good things for the environment, in my opinion. So the bill, as passed, expands the statewide goal to achieve carbon neutral emissions to 2045. It requires large buildings to reduce their carbon footprint, and it expands the state's fleet of zero emission vehicles. Dom, you mentioned too schools, and I know there was a lot of conversation about schools and whether or not solar should be required to be part of construction when you're building a school, that they should all be equipped with solar panels. That was ultimately stripped out of the bill. Another piece of this, Michael, was electrification, and that seemed pretty controversial. I know we've talked about that offline, Michael. I know that you have some thoughts on this issue generally. Why was that so controversial? What is electrification, and why did it get so much attention? And how do you see this moving forward, this issue? Because this is another one where I feel like it's not going to go away.
I think you're right about that. There's basically buildings themselves are big players in use of energy and the sources of energy and the things that we contribute to our carbon footprint. Buildings are a big part of that. We're all sort of familiar with vehicles and, moving toward, more reduced emission vehicles, and zero emission vehicles is part of this bill, and it's a meaningful part of this bill. Buildings are part of it too. You referenced schools, and it was a little bit curious, the legislative debate on this bill. Why aren't public school buildings a centerpiece of this bill? We spent a lot of money on school buildings. The short answer there is, in Maryland, we've already been doing public school buildings pretty much by the book for the last decade or two. Our public school projects, publicly funded, have had to meet sort of LEED energy efficiency standards, or in the last few years, or alternative equivalents. So we've already been building energy efficient schools, and that's been Maryland policy for some time now. So to some degree, what this bill is doing has been trying to say, for other state buildings, let's try and get them caught up to what we've already been doing with public schools. The idea of getting some school buildings all the way to zero emission there are some incentives in this bill, and I think we'll see movement in that direction. The local government's getting some carrots along the way, that next time you're going to propose a school building, if you can make it zero emission, there's some carrots at the end of the state funding pathway for you. That could be a way to see more on that front. But this issue of building electrification, I think it's an interesting issue that I don't know if it's coming back next year, but I think it will be part of the, not just Maryland, but sort of the American policy debate on climate change and environmental issues. Because what we're talking about is, if you build a building, a new office building, public or private, if you build a building tomorrow and you equip it with an entirely natural gas-based energy system for heat and for kitchen and hot water and so forth, to some degree, you've created a barrier to that building becoming plugged into the clean energy sources that are mostly generating electricity and delivering their power through the conventional electric grid. So to some degree, the idea of the way to have good energy policy for the next 50 years is build your buildings today so that they can make use of clean energy as readily as possible. You don't have to go and redesign the whole energy system in a 2023 building because in 2040 you want it to be on clean energy through electricity. So there were different ideas of what Maryland could do today on electrification, making buildings, public and private, electric ready. Eventually, and Dom, correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I think the bill that passed basically directed the State Public Service Commission, that's the state entity that oversees the regulated utilities for power companies and so forth. Public Service Commission is going to study and review a number of issues here, but one of them is, how could we move the building standards in our state in the direction of promoting or requiring electric-friendly buildings? So I think it's an interesting issue, and one that we're probably not done with either.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, especially when you talk about, some of the utilities and natural gas companies. I mean, Maryland has told them, if you want to do business here, you have to do it this way. We want you to provide better infrastructure, cleaner gas. And, talking to some of the folks from those utility companies, they've said, look, we've invested a lot of money just over the past few years because the state has told us to. And then to kind of pull the plug and say, actually, we're just going to get rid of natural gas. You can understand why that would get folks in a tizzy. And so that was a controversial component. I agree that this one's not ready for prime time. But Dom, like Michael said, the PSC is going to study this issue and come back with, recommendations on how you can move the ball forward to make Maryland more electric ready, especially when we're building new buildings. So that's going to be another thing, like Michael said, maybe not next year, but this issue generally is a big part of climate change. There are a lot of people that think everything should just go to electric, it's cleaner. But then again, you have a lot of folks out there who have invested a lot of money because the state has told them to provide stuff like natural gas. So that's obviously a big one. We'll have to see what the PSC says about that, Dom.
Yeah, I think the writing is pretty much on the wall. The timeline isn't clear, but we are moving to full electrification one way or another. It may be in the next decade, it may be in the next few decades. To electric cars, for example, that is growing hugely. I hear electrification in almost all of my planning and zoning conversations. The day is coming, and we can see it over the horizon. Don't know when it's going to be, but it's going to be soon.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
So big movement there on climate. And again, this is a bill that's been in for a few years, and this one finally passed. So some big movement there on climate stuff, Dom. That's it in your portfolio, in your wheelhouse, in the environment portfolio. Let's go to another issue that was a huge topic. Dom, you cover MACo's IT issues. Let's talk cybersecurity. With everything going on, local governments were already a huge target for malicious actors. And then Ukraine and Russia, that whole situation is leading to increased activity from hackers, from malicious folks overseas that have been increasingly targeting government entities, schools, private businesses, you name it. So this is something that I think coming into session, everybody knew was going to be a big deal. And then that sort of got ratcheted up when you had the conflicts going on overseas and the increased activity with cyber. But Dom, they did pass a package of bills, and let us know what was in the budget for cyber and how we think that's going to directly affect county government.
Yeah, Kevin. So it looks like that there will be $210 million in the budget to bolster state and local cyber defenses. The legislation includes a lot of cybersecurity local support funding. This means that there will be there will be help for local governments and school systems to upgrade their equipment.
Yeah, and that was a big component. I mean, MACo has been involved over the past interim in this work group, in this study to figure out what we need to do in Maryland We know that local governments and the state government have to work together here. We're connected in a lot of ways with our systems and equipment. So this is a united effort, and I think there are a lot of nuances that go into this. Obviously, we're not cyber experts, but we've had to put that hat on and learn a lot about cybersecurity, working with our professionals in county government who do this stuff every day. But Michael, I mean, this is one where you were involved as well. This was leadership involved. They knew this was going to be a big topic of conversation, and this is one where I think everybody knew this is going to be on the marquee of issues that the General Assembly wants to cover in the last session, and they did that.
Yeah, I think you're right that the writing was on the wall anyway, that there was enough attention. We've had a few high-profile incidents here in Maryland where, the Baltimore County Schools and Baltimore City government and a few other local governments across the state, and then probably most notably and most visibly the recent problems with the state health department and their website and data and so forth. All of this brought this issue into really crisp focus. There was no doubt at all that the General Assembly was going to want to take a leadership role and make sure, sort of like, let's get the excuses behind us. We want to have best practices. We want to have guidance from the right people. And if what the local governments need are some standards to live up to, let's make sure they have the tools in their tool belt to solve the problems. And so we don't end up with anybody looking around saying, well, we just had no idea or we weren't able to be prepared for this. I think where we landed here, and I'd invite you guys' thoughts, but I think where we landed here was basically in the right place, that there was, by circumstances of the economy and so forth, an opportunity for the state to make some short-term funding commitments in a variety of areas that wouldn't be massive ongoing commitments. So this meshed up perfectly. The idea of, let's deploy some money right now so that our various state agencies and our partners in local government can erect strong and smart defenses. We'll all be coordinated in the best path to get there. We'll make sure everybody has the resources to do it. And then we'll have some accountability through public processes. We're not going to, have a public report saying, here are our vulnerabilities, right? We have to, be smart about the way you do that. But you have some accountability through public process for if there's a fault or if there's someone who isn't living up to their end of the deal. I think they struck a pretty good balance on this stuff. And our local governments are going to get some resources to do a better job, to to try and prevent a problem from happening, but then also to have systems to recover if and when it does happen.
Yeah, and that's exactly the way I see it too, Michael. And going into this session, I mean, we've been saying, look, we need money to upgrade our legacy systems. The state and local governments need to do that. We need real-time monitoring. We need the state to be able to step in and procure equipment, and we need to ride on to bigger contracts. The state can often get a better deal because they're dealing in bulk, and we'd like to be able to ride on to those contracts. So I think all of that stuff is there, which is really good, and I think we do move the ball forward. I do think we're going to see some follow-up legislation to the package that passed, and look, this issue is not going to go away, so that is certainly going to be in line. So another one where I feel like the General Assembly did a good job. This took a lot of work, a lot of effort. And, especially the Senate, I think, spent a lot of time going through these bills and crafting them to address stakeholder concerns. And then also, to address the core tenets of exactly what we've been talking about and what needed to happen, and some of the recommendations from that report, which we'll link in the show notes as to what the experts thought needed to happen versus what actually did. But at the end of the day, really good product, in my opinion. There'll be some tweaks to it, but moving forward, this is an issue that's going to continue to get a lot of attention, and rightfully so. So Dom, after cyber, there are a few other environmental bills I want to get to that I know you want to talk about. So let's address those before we get to the bill that you're most passionate about, the MACo EMS initiative. What other issues in the environment, Dom, do you think are worth bringing up for our listeners now?
Yeah, so there's two bills that came across our desk this legislative session that did not pass, but I think they have a lot of merit, and I think we're going to definitely hear about them more in the future. The first one comes from Delegate Brooke Learman, House Bill 307, Senate Bill 292. And this is the packaging materials this puts the responsibility on the producers. So basically, it's the producer who really decides when you go and buy a product what that product is going to be packaged in. So if you're going in the grocery store and you pick up lettuce and it's in a plastic bag or in a little clamshell, if you go and you buy a Coke or a Pepsi and it's in that plastic bottle with that cap, it's the producers that are deciding what their product is going to be in. But during the life cycle of that product, that packaging, it's actually the county governments in Maryland and the taxpayers who have to pay for the recycling and eventually disposal of that material. What Delegate Learman's bill seeks to do is flip that whole model on its head and really start charging producers for their decisions on packaging. If you choose to use a material that's less recyclable, you're going to have to pay a fee. And then those fees would be put into a fund, and then counties can go into that fund to upgrade their recycling infrastructure so that we can recycle more. The model has been incredibly successful in parts of Canada and Europe. Bringing it to Maryland would be really fascinating to see how it would play out. And although it didn't go anywhere far this session, I have a gut feeling we're going to see this again soon.
And Michael, is this one where, I mean, we talked about sometimes you were there, I wasn't here yet for the Uber fight, where all of a sudden you had lobbyists showing up from all over the place representing, various clients. This seems like one where if you're going to start holding producers responsible, that's going to get the attention of the producers, right? And so this is going to be one where I think you have to deal with a lot of stakeholder input. But is this one where you feel like, people just start showing up out of the woodwork and saying, hang on a second, we need to be careful about how we do this. I agree with Dom. I think that it's a model that's been successful, and it's something that we're going to have to address. And putting it on the producer is a massive shift from the policy that we've had since we started recycling way back when, right?
Yeah. So I agree with you that as looking ahead to the process of changing this policy, this probably involves a wide scope of stakeholders, and that's always interesting, right? When there's lots of players at the table, it makes for complicated but really interesting policy making. Just like the climate bill we just spoke about. That final version of that bill was, I'm sure, at least 100 pages long and had dozens of different provisions. I mean, we only just scratched the surface and talking about what was in that big bill. In my mind here, this whole idea is sort of a core principle in public policy that I find super interesting. And that is, who should pay for a public service, right? And I mean, years ago, I went to school for public policy and so forth. And these were really neat little case studies when you're trying to teach people about public policy debates and so forth. Like, how much should you charge to get into a park? And or how much should you charge for an immunization or things like that? And do you want things to be paid for by taxpayers generally, or by those who benefit from the service? Or is there a third party who ought to be held accountable and so forth? We have this same debate for who pays for the roads and bridges. Is it the people who drive the cars, or is it the taxpayer, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, like this idea of who ought to pay for the public burden of trash, like trash disposal and recycling systems, that's really interesting public policy. And for a long time, you've had the innovations have gotten as far as maybe, do you do things like pay as you throw? This is a concept that some states have done, saying we're going to charge you for every bag of trash your family generates, but you won't be charged for a bin of recycling, and we'll try and make that an incentive to do more recycling. Okay, like you can see the policy argument there. This idea in this bill takes that concept even further, and it's a new frontier, saying we're forgetting the other leg of this stool, those who are the producers, the generators of all this plastic and all these packaging. They ultimately bear responsibility for the collective burden society has to throw away or to recycle all that stuff. And that's the level where you ought to apply some responsibility. Now, that's an interesting idea. I don't know how close Maryland is to effecting a policy to do this, but I think it's a really interesting approach to say, like, part of the way to reduce this waste stream is not just to change behavior at my household, but to change the behavior in those who are presenting things for sale to my household. And That's what Maryland's trying to look at here. So I agree with Dom. It's an interesting issue. Bill didn't make it this year, and for it to get done in our state is going to take some lift. But I don't think this debate is over. It's an interesting contour. I agree.
And Dom, not only producer responsibility for some of the products you were talking about, also a bill about mattresses. And this is not front page news. It doesn't get all the attention that other issues get, but mattresses are a big deal, a big problem when it comes to recycling them, right? So there was also legislation to try and address that issue. And it's kind of along the same lines. Walk us through that and what happened with the bill that sought to do that, and then the outlook moving forward.
Right. So Delegate Terry Hill introduced House Bill 1226, the Mattress Stewardship Program. And this is truly a fascinating piece of legislation and pretty big in scope if the legislature passed it and it was implemented. This session they didn't, but again, this is a bill that we anticipate coming in again, maybe in a new form. It definitely needs a little work. But what this bill will do, similar to Delegate Learman's bill, it would place responsibility for the product mattresses in the hands of the producer. And so these mattress producers would have to form stewardship organizations who would then have to create these recycling facilities where you buy a mattress, you take it to the recycling facility in your county. I believe in the legislation it said there had to be one per county or one per X number of thousand of people. So there would, if it was passed as is, there would be tons of these recycling centers. But these producer organizations, these stewardship organizations, would be ultimately responsible. All of this would be funded through a mattress stewardship fee, which would be levied on all mattresses sold in Maryland. It's a very interesting idea. It does raise the question, are people going to go to West Virginia, Delaware, and Pennsylvania to buy their mattresses if we're going to have this fee, depending on how much it is? And also, this legislation was very interesting because it really limited what you can do with a mattress besides recycling. Only in a limited number of scenarios can you either incinerate it or put it in a landfill, which is currently the method to get rid of these. So I think it's pretty fascinating. Definitely needs work, and we'll be seeing it in the future.
I agree. These are fascinating issues. They're going to be coming back around. We've seen these models work, like you said, Dom, in Europe and in Canada. And it's one that I think, again, sort of along the lines of the theme of this, we're going to see this come back. There's going to be a lot of pressure to make these policies reality and to address these issues generally. And this is a really good idea, in my opinion, a good policy to do that, is putting some of the onus on the producers. If you're going to decide to do something that is going to make it really difficult for governments on the ground level to recycle that product or to deal with it, then you need to step in and have skin in the game. I think that's a really interesting issue generally, and it's one that you're going to be dealing with, I think, Dom, for a few years. Michael, any thoughts on this issue generally? I mean, this is another one where I feel like deep policy guy that you are. You've seen the bills, you've seen the debate, and you've seen what's going on, across the world. What do you think about this issue?
The only thing I'd add here is with mattresses, and similar to like large appliances and so forth, you have to be careful how much burden you place on the person who's doing the right thing. Like, I'm done with this mattress, so I'll put it on the back of my truck and I'll take it to the landfill to be dropped off there and put into the landfill. The problem with saying, well, let's penalize that person because mattresses have contents that are bad for our landfills or whatever, so let's charge that person whatever, $50 to drop off a mattress at the landfill. The problem is, if you make the person doing the right thing bear the burden of the downside, you create an awkward, perverse incentive for people to just dump the landfill by the side of a country road. And so, with large items, you sometimes see that, well, I don't want to take it to the dump because they're going to charge me a fee, so I'm going to avoid that by just in the dark of night, we'll throw it off the side of the truck. So you want to be smarter about where you place the burden of these things, and if you do it at the purchase point, you avoid that weird incentive, potentially with mattresses and with other sorts of things. We already do this for electronic goods, where recycling of old computer equipment and monitors and so forth, they have a lot of mercury and other things that are kind of hazardous to put into the ground. So you pay a little bit extra at the time of purchase when you buy a new computer monitor. Maybe mattresses get the same kind of treatment, but all of this is rethinking who bears the responsibility for our societal obligation to take care of our own mess.
I like it. I think it's a good policy issue, and it's one that we will continue to talk about, I think, in the years ahead. And Dom, I want to transition to our final topic of today, which is a big, big deal for county governments, for MACo. It's a legislative initiative that we took on, and that is dealing with EMS reimbursements. I'm going to let you set the table and steal the show here, Dom. This is one that you worked really hard on, and I will say there was a good outcome here.
Yeah, so this bill has been absolutely exciting. If anyone sees me on the streets of Annapolis and notice that my hair is starting to recede, this also is the reason why. It has been an emotional roller coaster since we really started this initiative. So a little bit of history here. EMS reimbursement was last updated in 1999. And what happened then was you would get $100 if the ambulance showed up to your house and transported you to an emergency room. There is no reimbursement for any treatment in the field. There's no reimbursement if they took you to another facility, which actually under the 1999 law they couldn't do. And so what MACo did, we came in and said, this is not up to snuff. A lot has changed since 1999. It's now 2022. Just inflation, that $100 figure alone isn't doing it. On top of the expanded role of EMS in the wake of the pandemic and just with the way the medical system's going. So our initiative bill, it accomplished 4 primary things that I am personally very excited about. First of all, it raised that $100 reimbursement for transportation to $150. So we got a 50% increase, and that increase is now permanent. That's going to be a permanent increase going forward. There's no cliffs. That is the new figure. Second, you can now get up to $150 for mobile integrated health treatments, treatment in the field, treatment on the way to an emergency facility, which is just crazy. When an ambulance shows up to your house, they're giving you more than just gasoline. They're giving you a lot of care. And previously, we were not getting reimbursed for that care, and now we can. Another big innovation with this EMS bill is transport to facilities other than an emergency room. One thing we saw in the pandemic, our hospital systems are stressed. Under this new bill, maybe a urgent care is more appropriate. Maybe another medical care facility is more appropriate. So now ambulances can take you to a medical facility other than an ER if that's appropriate in the scenario, and they can get reimbursed for that. And then finally, we got 2 studies in this legislation. First is to look at how we fund mobile integrated health. Right now, we're going to get that $150 for mobile integrated health, but we don't really know if that's the proper way to fund this, if there's a new model, if there's a better model. So we got one study to look at how should we do this going forward. As of right now, we're getting no funds, so we definitely got a good stopgap measure, but we're going to explore how we can do it better in the future. And then the second study, and a lot of people don't know this unless you're in the industry, is inter-hospital transfers. So you're going from one medical facility to another. To get an ambulance to do that, there are people waiting 24 hours, 48 hours, incredibly long periods of time. And so we were able to get a study to really look into that issue, to how we can fix it and really improve that process going forward. And it's one of those quiet ones that you don't really see, but is so incredibly important.
Yeah, and it's important. We're talking about our volunteer EMS services, our career EMS services. They're going out, they're providing a lot of services, like you said, Dom, on site. We know about stuff like Narcan, where unfortunately we have an opioid epidemic that is still going on, even amidst the COVID pandemic. And that's a big part of it, right? Is that you'll send an ambulance out, somebody needs Narcan, and they refuse transport. And then all of a sudden, that ambulance who just made a big ride, they're using equipment, they're using gas, they're using personnel. It's like it never even happened. They never even provided service to that patient because they're not getting reimbursed for it. That's a problem. And when you talk about mobile integrated health, this is counties being proactive, our EMS folks being proactive, going out into the communities that they serve and meeting people where they are and providing that treatment in the community, because we know it's difficult for some people to get to a hospital or a health center, right? To get the treatment that they need, to get the services, the preventative stuff that they need, so that they don't have to call 911, so that we don't have all of these frequent flyers that constantly are dealing with, calling 911 for certain things. We want to go out and be proactive. That unfortunately was not reimbursable either. So I think that made a big splash. I think talking about mobile integrated health and what that would mean, being able to get this reimbursement. Michael, this is an initiative. I feel like we have to kick it to you as the executive director, someone who oversees the entire association. We have 4 initiatives every year. This is one that obviously our folks cared a lot about. How do you see this? I mean, what were your thoughts? This was a long and drawn out process. Like Dom said, it came down to the end pretty much. We were, watching committee vote lists. We were in subcommittees and committees. We were working with the sponsors who did a great job on this bill. But talk a little bit about the way you see this, how it played out, and where this fits for you in terms of, your totem pole of success in terms of MACo initiative.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that setup. I like the way this came together because this was the full range of public policy considerations, that this was a little bit of policy needs to catch up with modern times. It was a little bit of equity in the way we provide public services. What we're talking about here is sending a bill to your insurance company because you got medical care. I mean, it's not really a super complicated concept. We're not telling your family, please come up with $150 or we won't give you an ambulance ride. What we're saying is, hey, if you're under Medicaid, Medicare, or if you have Blue Cross or Aetna or some other health insurance, they should pay for this medical care like they do anything else. But also just the legislative process was fraught with, is this too costly? Do we have the definitions right? Are we getting the right level of providers? Without belaboring our faithful listeners, there were a lot of technical sides of this and complications and personal issues, and sort of like we needed a technical amendment for this and a new item came in there, and the Senate had one thing and the House had a different, it was almost every possible small hurdle in the legislative process was before us, and we managed to overcome all of them and deliver what I think is an excellent bill. I mean, as much as anything, I like the idea that we're going to recognize a wider range of things, of sort of deliveries. Like, Dom, I think you did a great job of explaining sometimes it's not the hospital that's the right place where you need to go. If we just need to set a broken ankle, the urgent care 4 miles away would be fine. We don't have to go 18 miles to a hospital. That's the right thing to do. It's a smarter health policy to recognize that. I'm really excited longer term about what this is going to mean for mobile integrated health. That if you've got a fleet of ambulances and trained staff to use them, we know that your busiest time is going to be at the night, in the nighttime and on the weekends, and you've got to respond to calls all day long, but you've got some time where there's a little slack in the rope. So deploy that company to your county fair for 4 days and give people diabetes screening, or give them pre-cancer, oral examinations, or give people blood pressure screening, the kind of preventative care that way too many people are missing. And if you can make that kind of investment and give people some basic screening and some guidance and some basic level healthcare, meet them where they are. They're on their way to get that corn dog, but they stop and get a blood pressure test. That might prevent an emergency down the road and save somebody's life one day, all because we've created a better model to make that a viable thing to do with your emergency equipment. That is really good public policy. I'm really proud that we got behind it, and MACo potentially making the difference between this being once again a dead bill and being a live bill. Really, really happy about that.
Yeah, that's what it's all about. This is a great bill. It's a great policy issue, and I think it's one that we're all proud to have been a part of. Special shout out to Senator Jason Gallion, Delegate Kevin Hornberger, who sponsored these bills in the Senate and the House. They did really good work here, and I'm really happy that the final product is one that we can all be proud of, and we've certainly moved the needle. So, gentlemen, to close this out, I feel like we have Dom and Michael here, opposite ends of the spectrum. Dom, at least for you, neophyte in Annapolis when it comes to policy, not generally, but just your first session, first sine die, versus Michael, who has been here for, I don't even know how many sine dies. And we've been through some interesting and weird sine dies over the past few years. I want to get both of your thoughts. I'll start with you, Dom, on just the atmosphere of sine die this year, the way you saw it. You were here all session. You saw the way that the House and the Senate operated. We're still dealing with COVID. But I want to get your thoughts just on the vibe of sine die. It was beautiful weather, which I feel like played a role in how that came together. But a lot of functions, a lot of events, as we said earlier, things are starting to get back to normal right in time for sine die. What were your thoughts, Dom, just generally on how people were feeling on sine die, your workload? I feel like most of the big issues were taken care of, but what did you think in terms of sine die? Was it what you were expecting? Was it not? Was it less? Was it more? What do you think?
So my sine die, and I hope I pronounced that right, was pretty great. It started out with some heartburn on this EMS initiative. The bill actually didn't pass until about 10 p.m. And it wasn't until probably about noon that morning that we knew that we were going to get a bill in a good fashion. Other than that, though, it seemed pretty relaxed. There was not really a ton of loose ends, at least in my portfolio. I had a great time. I thought there would be more balloons and confetti. I don't know where they would have come from or what I was expecting, but I thought it would be a little more celebratory. But I mean, everyone was pretty joyous and it was a good day.
All right, Michael, I'll take it to you. Yeah, I mean, what do you think, Michael? I mean, look, I think, again, most of the big issues were tied up and put to bed, but there were a lot of things lingering. You know, coming out of COVID, if you will, we're still dealing with it again, but things were getting back to normal. Was it a normal-ish sine die for you, Michael, you know, as like the pre-pandemic times were? Or was it more casual? That's kind of how I saw it, more casual, people not as stressed out as you normally would see because of those big issues like climate. The climate bill was already put to bed. Some of the big hot ticket items were sort of done. What do you think?
Right. I think it was different for a number of reasons. And the COVID effect on the session was very present early and abated over the course of the 90 days. So being around town on the final days of session was relatively close to normal. And that was, in my judgment, kind of welcome. But at the same time, another factor that is not COVID related, but it's a function of where we are in the political cycle. For this being the final year of a 4-year term, there's a particular provision that ordinarily in 2021, if the General Assembly passes a bill and the governor vetoes it 3 weeks after the legislative session, the legislature can come back the following year in 22 and override that veto and have it take effect. You can't do that when you skip from one term to the next. So because this fall there's going to be an election for the entire General Assembly, you can't have next year's General Assembly override the governor's veto on acts of this year's General Assembly. So what that meant was, I think we've talked about this on earlier versions of our pod, was a number of issues where the General Assembly anticipated the governor might intervene and veto a bill. They got them passed early enough in session. They weren't thinking on a 90-day cycle. They were thinking on like an 88, 89-day cycle so that there would be time for the governor to act and then for the legislature, if they wanted to override vetoes within their 90-day window. So what that meant was some big towering issues like this climate bill that we started off today talking about. That was a candidate for that kind of discussion. And if that had gone down to the wire and there had been 10 or 15 items up in the air how they would get resolved, that would have been nerve-wracking for probably a third of Annapolis on the last day of session. But instead, it was nerve-wracking on day like 87 instead of on like day 77 instead of day 90. So last day of session felt a little less panicked than usual, a little more casual. And I think from the county government's perspective, we had a sense like that. We talked a little bit about the cybersecurity stuff, and that didn't really all come together until sort of late in the day on the final day of session. But we had indications that the direction was fine. The details would sort themselves out. So I don't know, a little less panic than a usual last day. And I don't know, I felt pretty good about that. I'm thankful.
Yeah, I think it was a good sine die, less panicky. Got to see a lot of people. That was good. people getting back to somewhat normalcy. So that's always good. But Dom, any further reflections on your first session at MACo before we wrap this up today?
I have to say, it has been such an exciting 90 days and experience. I am so thrilled that it's over, and yet at the same time, I miss the hustle and bustle of session. I'm a Pennsylvania boy, for those of you who don't know, for the listeners. So in Pennsylvania and Harrisburg, it's a full-time legislature. So I was thinking, how are we going to make this work in just 3 months? And you know what, Maryland, you did it, and you're going to continue to do it. And so very exciting experience. I just want to thank really quick everyone who worked on the EMS bill, the stakeholders, the sponsors, the staffers behind the scenes. It was a MACo initiative, but this was truly a group and team effort. So thank you to everyone who helped get it over the line. And yeah, I can't wait for next year. Let's play in 2023.
All right, and
Well
I'll
said.
close with this. Michael, I get this question a lot. So as the executive director, so for MACo now, we're at the beach. We pack up now until next January. Is that what happens moving forward for MACo? I mean, is that what we're supposed to do now, or is there anything else coming?
That's it.
Through?
That's it, everybody. We just unroll your hammock and enjoy the beautiful weather, and we'll see everybody, at Christmas time when we start getting ready for another legislative session, right? We get that question all the time. No, I mean, like even just among your issues, Dom, there have to be at least a half dozen that turned into informal work groups and actual task forces and directives to state agencies to review or study or convene work sessions on different topics and so forth. There is policy work being done at the state level 12 months a year for certain, and that's independent of the role that MACo, and not like other stakeholders don't have the same circumstance, but we have members to attend to as well. So our counties are going through their own budgets for the next couple of months. We will have a lot of engagement with county governments on ongoing issues and implementation from this legislative session and their own priorities back home, where we play some guiding and educational roles. We do conferences and events all through the summer and fall for our members. We will be loaded up, and before long, we will be asking our members, hey, what legislative topics should MACo have on our list as legislative initiatives for the next session? So we just got a good success on emergency medical services and bringing that law up to snuff. We've got a nice track record of getting stuff done in Annapolis and working with both parties and leadership and fellowship. So what should be next on our list? What should we tackle? We've had a lot of big issues we've gotten into, and we're trying to make it so our counties can deliver excellent service for their residents. What's next? So that's where we are every April and May, is we start looking at our calendar. How long till January?
Yes, exciting stuff over the interim. I have not gone to the beach yet, and hopefully we will all get some R&R, but it is not just kick up the feet in the hammock and relax. MACo never stops. It's a well-oiled machine. So we have a lot of stuff to do between now and then, but I'm happy with the way this session turned out. I think MACo did a good job advocating for counties. I think all of our counties stepped up. All of our professional staff back at the county level who make this all work. They're the experts, but a really good session. We'll continue with this theme over the next few weeks. We'll have other members of the policy team on to discuss their issues as well, and sort of, like Michael said, tie up those loose ends, but we'll leave it there for today. Dominic, thank you so much for being with us. You're always a star of the pod. I think everybody knows you're a Pennsylvania boy at this point, so thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
All right. If you enjoy the podcast, please go ahead and subscribe. That way, all these episodes will be sent directly to the device of your choice. You can also follow along on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and then, of course, our Conduit Street blog has all the wrap-ups from this session, all the policy areas. We'll link that on the show notes. But for Dom Butchko and Michael Sanderson, this is Kevin Kinnally signing off, and we will talk to you soon.